What do you do when you spot 130 armed boats sitting quietly in the most dangerous strip of water on Earth, and nobody is firing a single shot? That silence right there, that's the scary part. Because silence before something like this almost never means peace. Before we get into it, if you want more videos like this one, breaking down real conflicts as they actually happen, hit that subscribe button now, tap the bell so you don't miss the next update, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and I read every single comment. Let's set the scene properly, because you need to understand exactly where we are before any of this makes sense. A commercial satellite passed over the Strait of Hormuz on a clear morning and picked up something nobody expected to see out in the open. Not 5 or 6 boats, not even 30 or 40, somewhere around 130 small, fast Iranian military boats, sitting in 2 organized clusters, fully visible, doing absolutely nothing threatening on the surface. No missiles fired, no shots exchanged. Just boats, parked in one of the most fought-over channels on the planet, the one that a huge share of the entire world's oil has to pass through to reach the rest of us. That image didn't stay quiet for long. Within hours, it was on screens at U.S. Central Command headquarters in Florida. And the people looking at it weren't confused. They knew exactly what those boats were. What they wanted to know was simpler and much scarier. Why show this now? And how far is Iran willing to take it? Here's the part most people miss. By the time those boats showed up on satellite, the United States already had 3 entire aircraft carrier strike groups sitting in that region. 3. That level of naval buildup hadn't happened since the Iraq invasion, back in 2003. So this wasn't some sudden overreaction from Washington. This was already a war that had been running for months. The boats just made it impossible to ignore anymore. Let's talk about what these small boats actually are, because the number alone means nothing without context. Most of them are tiny. Fiberglass hulls, aluminum hulls, a few slightly bigger patrol boats mixed in, and a lot of what are basically armed jet skis with machine guns bolted on. One of these boats against a modern American warship isn't a fight, it's barely a warning shot. But Iran was never trying to build a navy that could go toe-to-toe with America. Analysts gave this fleet a nickname that tells you everything: the Mosquito Fleet. You don't beat someone with one mosquito. You wear them down with hundreds of them, all coming from different directions, faster than a radar screen can sort out which one is real and which one is a decoy. It's not about firepower, it's about confusion. It's about forcing a warship captain to make an impossible choice in under 2 seconds. Fire on a boat that might just be scouting, or hold your fire and risk a real attack slipping through. This pattern isn't new either. It goes back years. In May of 2021, a group of Iranian boats raced toward American ships in the strait, getting within about 140 meters before U.S. Forces fired warning shots to push them back. Iran denied doing anything wrong and blamed the Americans for provoking it. That back and forth, 2 governments telling 2 completely different stories about the same 5 minutes, that's the exact pattern you're going to see over and over again in this story. In 2022, Iranian boats came within 50 yards of an American ship and held that position for almost an hour before a warning flare and a blaring horn finally pushed them off. The U.S. Navy called it unsafe and unprofessional. Remember that phrase, because you'll hear something almost identical show up again years later, except this time on a much bigger scale. So when 2026 arrived, nobody at the Pentagon looked at a photo of massed Iranian boats and thought this was strange. They had watched smaller versions of this exact move for years. What changed wasn't the tactic. It was the size of it, and the fact that this time, both sides had live weapons ready instead of warning shots. Now here's where the real story begins, because none of this makes sense without understanding how we got here. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of strikes across Iran. And among those killed in that first strike was Iran's supreme leader himself, a man who had ruled the country for nearly 40 years. This wasn't a minor military target. This was the single most powerful religious and political figure in the entire Islamic Republic, gone in one strike. Iranian state television confirmed his death the next day and announced 40 days of national mourning. Killing a supreme leader doesn't just remove one man from power. It shatters the entire structure that country is built around, because Iran's whole political system revolves around that one office. Within about a week, Iran's clerical council moved fast and named the late leader's own son as his successor. The military, the political leadership, and the Revolutionary Guard all backed him almost instantly. Analysts who study the region read that choice as a message aimed straight at Washington and Jerusalem. It said, "You thought killing one man would break us, but we're going to put someone just as hardline in his place, maybe even more so." There was an even stranger twist to this. American officials later admitted that the strike which killed the supreme leader had also wiped out most of the moderate successors they had been quietly tracking as possible future leaders. So, instead of removing one dangerous man and opening a door to reform, the strike accidentally cleared the field for someone even less willing to compromise. That combination, a hardline installation happening within days, layered on top of a strike that had removed every softer alternative, became the backdrop for everything Iran did militarily for the rest of the year, including the boats. Iran's first big response wasn't military at all, it was economic. It shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian officials broadcast warnings over open radio telling every single ship out there that nothing was getting through. Now, technically under international law, one country can't just unilaterally close an international strait like that. Britain's navy said as much publicly. But when there's active fighting nearby, legal on paper and actually safe to sail through are two very different things, and every shipping company on the planet understood that difference immediately. Tankers turned around. Ships sat in port for weeks. Oil and gas prices moved within days. By mid-March, reports described hundreds of ships stranded at the entrance to the strait, many of them flying flags from countries that had nothing to do with this fight. All of them too nervous to gamble on whether Iran's warnings were real policy or just bluster. President Trump publicly called on other countries with a stake in that shipping lane, China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, to send their own ships to help secure the waterway, while making it clear American strikes on Iranian targets would continue no matter what. By early April, that pressure turned into a direct ultimatum: reopen the strait by a set deadline or face even harder strikes on Iranian infrastructure. Iran refused to negotiate under that kind of threat. The deadline passed. The strikes kept coming. Then, on April 8th, the first real chance at peace appeared. A ceasefire was reached, and it reportedly included a promise from Iran to fully reopen the strait. For a few weeks, it actually looked like it might hold. It didn't. By the middle of April, Iran had gone back to controlling traffic through the strait on its own terms, instead of fully reopening it. And on April 13th, the United States responded by imposing a full naval blockade on Iranian ports. Over the following weeks, American forces intercepted dozens of vessels trying to move in and out of Iran. Within a month, that number had climbed past 80, even though tracking firms separately reported that some ships had still managed to slip through in both directions. On April 19th, U.S. Marines working alongside a guided missile destroyer carried out the blockade's first direct seizure, boarding and taking control of an Iranian-flagged ship outright. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was an active military operation with real consequences for anyone caught in the middle. And this is exactly the environment that pushed Iran's fast boat fleet back into action. By early May, with the blockade squeezing hard and the ceasefire basically dead in practice, Iran pushed its small boats back into the strait in force. Mines became part of the pressure too, not just boats. Trump ordered the Navy to shoot and sink any boat caught laying sea mines, saying there would be no hesitation whatsoever. On May 3rd, Trump announced the U.S. military would start actively helping free up shipping through the strait, starting the very next morning. That operation got a name, Project Freedom, and it launched on May 4th. According to Central Command, Iran responded to that American escort effort by launching cruise missiles, drones, and small attack boats at commercial ships, and in some cases, straight at U.S. Navy vessels. American forces intercepted the incoming threats, and Apache and Seahawk helicopters sank 6 small Iranian boats in a single morning. Separate reports on Project Freedom's opening days put the total number of Iranian boats destroyed even higher, alongside a strike on a commercial vessel flying a foreign flag. The admiral overseeing that operation didn't hold back in his public comments, saying he had strongly warned Iran to stay away from American assets and accusing the Revolutionary Guard of trying to terrorize commercial shipping, while U.S. forces worked to keep global trade moving. That brings us to what was actually sitting in that region by the time those 130 boats got picked up by satellite. By late April, the United States had 3 full aircraft carrier strike groups operating in the Middle East at the same time. One of the biggest carriers in the entire American fleet was there. A second was there. And a third had just arrived after sailing all the way around the southern tip of Africa, specifically to avoid exposure to threats in the Red Sea. Central Command described the combined footprint of that deployment as more than a dozen accompanying ships, over 200 aircraft, and more than 15,000 sailors and Marines. So when Iran's fast boat fleet massed in the strait in May, it wasn't sailing out against a handful of patrol ships. It was sailing directly into a waterway, already packed with American firepower, operating under direct orders to sink anything caught laying mines. No hesitation. That's the real scale behind the moment Apache and Seahawk helicopters sank 6 Iranian boats before lunch. If this is hitting you the way it's hitting me, do me a quick favor. Hit like on this video right now. It genuinely tells YouTube to push this story to more people who need to understand what's actually happening in that strait, and it takes you 2 seconds. Now let's get to the heart of it, the moment that probably brought you here. There's a psychological layer to all of this that almost nobody talks about, and it matters more than the weapons themselves. Every one of those close encounters over the years, from 2021 all the way through this year, was never really about winning a firefight. It was about forcing an American commander into an impossible decision, in real time, with incomplete information. Do you fire on a boat that might just be shadowing you, or do you hold back and risk letting a real threat get close enough to strike? Now, multiply that decision by dozens of boats coming from every direction at once, some of them decoys, some of them not, and you start to understand exactly why the Pentagon takes this mosquito fleet doctrine so seriously. It was never really about naval firepower. It's about overwhelming human judgment under extreme pressure. And that is a much harder problem to solve with a bigger ship. Here's why this stretch of water matters to literally everyone watching this, not just people in the region. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is about 21 nautical miles wide. Every ship has to squeeze through 2 lanes, each roughly a mile across, with a buffer zone in between. Through that narrow gap moves close to a quarter of the entire world's oil traded by sea, and a huge share of the world's liquefied natural gas, too. When over 100 armed boats start massing in a channel that tight, it doesn't matter who you are or where you live. Oil traders in Singapore notice within minutes. Shipping insurers in London notice. Military planners in Washington notice. Everybody's watching and everybody's exposed. That buildup of 130 boats didn't appear out of nowhere either. By the time it happened, U.S. forces had reportedly carried out well over 10,000 strikes against Iranian targets since the war began, and had damaged or destroyed more than 150 Iranian vessels of every type. That number is exactly why Iran needed a fleet running into the hundreds, and by some estimates over 1,000 boats in total, just to guarantee it could still mass a big show of force whenever it wanted to send a message. And then on May 6th, everything paused. Trump halted Project Freedom, citing what he called serious progress toward a possible final agreement with Iran. I want to be precise here, because it matters a lot. A pause is not an ending. The blockade stayed exactly where it was. The dispute over the strait stayed exactly where it was. The military posture on both sides didn't move an inch. What changed was the speed of the fighting, not the standoff underneath it. This is also where the story gets genuinely contested, and I think it's more honest to say that plainly instead of smoothing it over. Iranian state media described its own speedboat fleet as having turned the Strait of Hormuz into a no-go zone for the American Navy, and rejected American claims about degrading Iran's forces as hollow talk that didn't match reality on the water. Those are Iranian government claims, coming from state-controlled broadcasters with an obvious interest in projecting strength, no matter what actually happened. And to be fair, in the other direction, American officials also made claims that went further than what independent sources could confirm, describing Iran's navy as essentially finished. Iranian outlets rejected that completely too. The honest version of events almost certainly sits somewhere in the middle, between two governments each telling the story in the way that serves them best. What we can say, with more confidence, because independent reporting backs it up, is that the pause didn't last. On July 7th, the United States launched what officials called powerful retaliatory strikes after Iranian forces hit 3 commercial ships transiting the strait. That same week, Iranian state television broadcast footage of hundreds of thousands of mourners marching toward a mosque for a funeral procession honoring the slain supreme leader, with some of them openly calling for revenge. The strikes that followed hit dozens of targets, including Iranian air defense systems, coastal radar sites, missile and drone capabilities, and more than 60 Revolutionary Guard small boats in and near the strait. That's a scale of small boat targeting far beyond the handful sunk back in May, and it shows just how central this mosquito fleet strategy had become to the entire conflict by midsummer. This war was never just a two-country fight either. The United Arab Emirates publicly said it was willing to join a U.S.-led effort to secure the strait, a meaningful move given how exposed its own waters are. Iran, on the other hand, stood up its own authority, an Iranian body claiming the right to regulate, and at times fully close, transit through the strait on its own terms, completely separate from any international framework. NATO stayed mostly on the sidelines diplomatically, preparing for a possible support role without putting boots or ships directly into the fighting. Before we go further, if you're finding this useful, share it with one person who still thinks this is just a regional squabble that doesn't affect them. It affects gas prices, shipping costs, and grocery bills everywhere. And most people have no idea how close this actually came to spiraling further. Now let's talk about the cost, because a story about boats and satellites can start to feel abstract if you only measure it in hardware. The documented toll from this crisis includes 1 tugboat sunk, at least 17 merchant ships damaged, roughly 7 of those abandoned entirely by their crews, 2 merchant ships captured outright, 12 sailors killed or missing, and 1 port worker killed with 2 more wounded in a separate attack. Those aren't statistics. Those are ordinary sailors doing ordinary cargo runs who got caught in a choke point that turned into a war zone almost overnight. The economic shockwaves spread just as fast. Before this war started, roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil and about a fifth of global liquefied natural gas moved through this one strait. The moment Iran began restricting traffic in late February, oil and gas prices moved almost immediately on markets everywhere. OPEC and its partner countries held an emergency meeting in early April and agreed to raise production to help cushion the shock. War risk insurance for ships transiting the strait shot up within days, and some insurers reportedly stopped covering that route entirely for stretches of the conflict, which for a shipping company is basically the same as the strait being physically closed, even without any government officially declaring it shut. As of the most recent updates, the picture is still genuinely unresolved. Trump announced he was canceling a planned new wave of strikes, reportedly after discussions with regional leaders who raised concerns about the conflict spreading further. He said American forces remained ready to move again, but that he'd agreed to hold off because a framework for a deal had reportedly been reached, one that would include reopening the strait and addressing Iran's nuclear program. That optimism didn't even survive 24 hours. Within a day, Iran was publicly denying that direct talks with Washington had resumed at all, even as Iranian officials separately confirmed they were talking with a neighboring country about establishing a new shipping route around the dispute entirely. There's now talk of a narrow first agreement focused just on reopening the strait, with a much bigger, slower second phase focused on Iran's nuclear program down the line. Whether either of those actually holds is something nobody on either side is willing to promise right now. So where does that leave the moment that probably brought you to this video? Those 130 Iranian boats sitting quietly in two formations, caught by satellite in broad daylight? It sits inside a war that began with the death of a man who had ruled his country for nearly 4 decades, ran through a ceasefire that collapsed within weeks, an active naval blockade, an operation that sank Iranian boats by the handful in May, an escalation in July that saw the U.S. strike more than 60 small boats in a single wave, and a diplomatic process that looks like it's one social media post away from falling apart completely. Those boats weren't some random provocation that came out of nowhere. They were Iran proving something in the most visible way it possibly could, visible enough for a commercial satellite to catch it in broad daylight. Despite months of American strikes, despite the blockade, despite repeated claims of a crippled navy, the fast boat fleet at the center of Iran's entire strategy in that strait was still there, still numerous, and still able to mass on short notice whenever Tehran decided it needed to send a message. Whether that message actually changes anything, whether the strait fully reopens under whatever gets negotiated next, or whether this is just the quiet moment before another round of strikes. Nobody watching this closely on either side is claiming to know the ending yet. So, here's what I want from you before you go. Tell me what you think happens next. Does this strait actually reopen for good, or is this just the calm stretch before round 2? Put your answer in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you want to be there the moment this story moves again, make sure you're subscribed, because this is nowhere close to finished.